The dust of redemption was the color of old blood, a fine red powder that clung to everything, the sun-bleached clapboard of the buildings, the sweat on a man's brow, the silence that hung in the air. On this day the silence was shattered. Gunshots cracked like a bullwhip, sharp and final, echoing off the false fronts of the general store and the land office. Panicked screams followed, thin and reedy against the percussive roar of pistols. Inside the Redemption Bank and Trust, Caleb Marin was on the floor, the rough-hewn planks pressing into his cheek. The air was a choking mix of cordite, stale cigar smoke, and the metallic tang of fear. He had come into town for a sack of wheat and a tin of salt, a simple, solitary trip that had dissolved into chaos. Now he kept his head down, his focus narrowed to the scuffed toes of his boots and the frantic hammering of his own heart. He was a rancher, not a lawman, not a hero. The part of him that had been a soldier was buried deep under years of hard soil and willed forgetting. A man's voice smooth as polished walnut, but with an edge like broken glass sliced through the din. Gentlemen, ladies, a simple transaction is all this is. Your cooperation is the only collateral I require. Caleb risked a glance. The speaker stood in the center of the room, a tall figure in a black duster, his movements unhurried and precise. He was handsome in a cruel way, with dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. This was Silas Kane, a name that had become a whisper of dread across the territory for the past 6 months. His gang moved with the practiced brutality of wolves, but Kane himself was different. He conducted his robberies with the theatrical flair of a stage performer, his violence always purposeful, never random. 2 of his men were stuffing canvas bags with currency, their faces hidden behind dusty bandanas. A third held a shotgun on the terrified teller. But Kane's attention was fixed on the man standing resolute by the door, a silver star pinned to his vest, Sheriff Elias Thorne. Elias was a good man, a man Caleb had known since the war. They had shared hardtack and harder memories in the trenches of Shiloh. Elias was older now, his hair more silver than brown, but his back was ramrod straight and his hand hovered near the worn grip of his Colt. This town is under my protection. Kane Elias said, his voice a low growl. You'll get nothing here but lead. Silas Kane smiled, a slow, chilling expression that did not reach his eyes. Protection. An admirable sentiment, Sheriff. But protection is an illusion. There are only debts, and a man must always pay what he owes. Kane took a deliberate step forward. Elias drew his pistol. The movement was a fraction too slow, a testament to the years that had stiffened his joints. One of Kane's men swung the butt of his rifle, a sickening crack echoing through the bank as it connected with the sheriff's temple. Elias crumpled to the floor, his pistol skittering across the planks. A collective gasp went through the room. Caleb's muscles tensed, his body screaming to move to act, but the cold logic of survival held him pinned to the floor. He was 1 man unarmed against 4. It was a fool's equation. Silas knelt beside the fallen sheriff, his movements almost tender. He ignored the groans of the wounded man and reached for something around his neck. A thin silver chain. With a delicate tug, he broke it free. Dangling from the chain was a small silver locket, intricately etched with the shape of a single lily. Time stopped for Caleb Marin. The world narrowed to that small piece of silver glinting in the dusty light. He knew its every line, every imperfection. He had given that locket to his wife Sarah on their first anniversary, the lily, a nod to her favorite flower. After she'd passed, he couldn't bear to look at it, the weight of it too heavy for his heart. He had given it to Elias for safekeeping, a silent pact between friends, to guard a sacred memory. Silas Kane held it up, examining it with the detached curiosity of a collector. beautiful," he murmured, his voice carrying in the sudden stillness. A reminder that even in the harshest dust, something lovely can be stolen away. He slipped the locket into his vest pocket as if it were his own. A fire ignited in Caleb's chest, a white-hot rage that burned away all thought of caution. He pushed himself to his knees. The movement drew Kane's gaze. For a heartbeat, their eyes met across the room. Caleb saw no greed in Kane's expression, no simple avarice. He saw something far more terrifying: certainty. A deep, abiding conviction, as if this act of theft was not a crime, but a reclamation. "Let him be," Caleb heard himself say, his voice raw. "Take the money and go." Kane's smile returned this time, tinged with something akin to pity. "The money is incidental, my friend. It's the principle of the thing." He turned back to Elias, who was stirring, trying to push himself up. "Some accounts can only be settled in person." Without another word, Silas Kane drew his revolver, a silver-inlaid Remington, and fired a single, deafening shot. The bullet struck Elias Thorne in the chest. The sheriff's body went rigid, then collapsed, a dark stain spreading across his star. The spell was broken. Screams erupted anew. Kane's men, their bags full, backed toward the door. Silas gave one last look at the silent room, his gaze sweeping over Caleb with unnerving focus, before he turned and strode out into the blood-red dust of redemption. Caleb scrambled across the floor to his friend. He knelt beside Elias, pressing a hand to the wound, but it was useless. The life was already draining from the old sheriff's eyes. "Caleb?" Elias whispered, a bloody froth on his lips. "I'm here, Elias, I'm here." The locket. He knew. The sheriff's eyes clouded over his last breath, a rattling sigh. Caleb stayed there, kneeling in his friend's blood, and the sounds of the gang's horses galloping away, fading into the distance. The sack of wheat and tin of salt were forgotten. The quiet life he had built for himself in the wake of war and loss had been torn open. Silas Kane had not just robbed a bank and killed a sheriff. He had stolen a piece of Caleb's soul, a memory of his dead wife, and in doing so had resurrected a ghost Caleb had spent years trying to bury. The debt Kane spoke of was a mystery, but the theft of the locket was a declaration of war, a personal one. Burst. The weeks that followed were filled with a silence louder than any gunshot. Caleb's ranch was a lonely stretch of hard-packed earth and wind-bitten prairie tucked into the cradle of the Dragoon Mountains. The small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands felt more like a tomb than a home. Every corner held a memory of Sarah, the way she'd hum while kneading dough, the scent of lavender that clung to the quilt on their bed. Now those memories were tainted by the image of her locket in Silas Kane's hand. He moved through his days in a fog of grim routine. He mended fences, forked hay, and checked his small herd of cattle, his movements mechanical. But at night, the ghosts came. He would dream of the war of the mud and the blood, the screams of men whose names he could no longer recall. Interspersed with the chaos of battle was a single recurring image. A young man's face, pale with shock, staring at him in the half-light of a mistaken dawn. He'd always wake in a cold sweat, the boy's identity, a frustrating blur just beyond the grasp of his memory. The town of Redemption mourned its sheriff and lived in fear. A new deputy, a young, earnest man named Finn, did his best to maintain order, but he was out of his depth. Silas Kane and his gang were a phantom menace, striking settlements dozens of miles apart, their motives a dark puzzle. They weren't just taking money. They were burning land deeds, scattering herds, and leaving behind cryptic messages scrawled on barn doors. The land remembers. A debt of blood. The attacks seemed random, but Caleb felt a cold certainty that they were all connected, part of a larger, terrifying design that had its epicenter right here. His friend's murder had not been a random act of violence. It had been a message, and Caleb was the intended recipient. He kept to himself, avoiding town, letting his grief and rage curdle into a hard, bitter resolve. He cleaned his Winchester until the action was smooth as silk, and spent his evenings practicing his draw, the muscle memory from his army days, returning with grim familiarity. He was waiting. He didn't know for what, but he knew trouble had a way of finding a man, whether he looked for it or not. One afternoon, nearly a month after the robbery, he was riding the southern fence line, the low sun casting long, skeletal shadows across the landscape. The air was still the only sound, the creak of his saddle, and the steady plod of his horse. That's when he saw it, a flicker of movement near a dry creek bed, a patch of dark color against the pale ochre of the earth. He dismounted, rifle in hand, and approached with the cautious tread of a man who expects the worst. Lying in the dust, tangled in the brittle arms of a dead mesquite bush, was a woman. Her dress, a simple calico, was torn and stained. Her dark hair was matted with dirt and blood. One of her legs was bent at an unnatural angle, and her breathing was a series of shallow, ragged gasps. He knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. It was faint but steady. Her skin was feverish to the touch. She was Apache, he guessed from her features, though she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps not even 20. Her arms were covered in scrapes and bruises, the raw, chafed marks of rope bindings still visible on her wrists. She was an escapee. As he gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and wide, with a primal terror, the look of a cornered animal. She flinched away from his touch, trying to scramble backward despite her injuries, a pained whimper escaping her lips. "Easy now," Caleb said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "I'm not going to hurt you." He offered her his canteen. She stared at it, her gaze darting from the water to his face, weighing trust against desperation. Finally, thirst won. She took the canteen with a trembling hand and drank the water spilling down her chin. He knew instantly where she had come from. Rumors had been circulating about Silas Kane's camp, about the captives he took, people who simply vanished from the trail. Taking this woman in meant inviting the devil to his doorstep. It meant the end of waiting. It meant bringing the war he'd been anticipating directly to his home. His rational mind told him to leave her, to ride for the deputy in town and make her someone else's problem. But when he looked into her eyes, he didn't see an Apache woman or a stranger. He saw the same raw vulnerability he'd seen in the bank hostages, the same desperate fight for life he'd seen in dying soldiers. He saw a reflection of his own brokenness. Leaving her here to die was not an option. It would be a betrayal of Elias, of Sarah, of the small fragment of the man he used to be. "Trouble finds you whether you look for it or not." He muttered to himself the words, a bitter acceptance. With painstaking care, he lifted her into his arms. She was light, almost frail, but she made no sound as he carried her to his horse. He mounted, settling her in front of him, and turned his horse for home. As they rode, the setting sun painted the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. Caleb held the unconscious woman against his chest, the warmth of her body a fragile anchor in the encroaching darkness. He had just made a choice. He had invited Silas Kane to his door, and he would be ready when he knocked. Malfer. He named her Naya, the first word she whispered when she finally broke her fever-induced silence 2 days later. The name was a fragile thing, spoken in a voice hoarse from dehydration and disuse. For those first days, she was a silent, watchful presence in his cabin. He set her broken leg with splints made from cottonwood branches and wrapped it tightly. He cleaned her wounds, fed her broth, and sat by her bed through the long nights, listening to her fitful, nightmare-ridden sleep. She communicated through her eyes. They followed his every move, sharp and intelligent, assessing him with a wariness that went bone deep. She was a survivor, and Caleb respected the steel he saw glinting beneath her fear. He gave her space, moving about his chores with a quiet deliberation, letting the familiar rhythms of the ranch be a balm for them both. He never asked her what happened, how she'd escaped. Some wounds are not made of flesh, and he knew that pressing on them would only make them fester. Their first conversation was sparse. "You need to eat," he said, placing a bowl of stew on the small crate beside her cot. She looked at the food, then at him. Why? The question hung in the air. It wasn't about the stew. It was about everything. Why help her? Why risk himself because no one else was going to? Caleb answered the simple truth of it, feeling more profound than he intended. After that, a tentative trust began to form. She started to eat without prompting. When she was strong enough to move with a crutch he'd fashioned for her, she began to contribute in small ways. She mended his torn shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She sorted dried beans at the table while he cleaned his rifle. They rarely spoke, but a language of shared action grew between them. Her presence began to fill the empty spaces in the cabin, her quiet industry a counterpoint to his grim preparations. The knock on the door came a week after he found her. It wasn't the thunderous arrival he'd expected, but a probing assault, a test. It was just after dusk. Nia was by the hearth, her hands busy weaving a small basket from dried grasses she'd collected near the door. Caleb was sharpening an axe blade, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel, a meditative sound in the firelit room. The first sign of trouble was the nervous whinny of his horse from the corral. Caleb's head snapped up, his hand freezing on the axe. He looked at Nia. She had gone perfectly still, her eyes wide, fixed on the door. "Get down," he whispered, his voice deadly calm, "and stay away from the window." He moved to the wall, grabbing the Winchester. He peered through a small crack in the shutter he'd deliberately left. 3 riders were dismounting by his fence, their forms dark silhouettes against the twilight sky. They moved with a swaggering confidence that marked them as Silas Kane's men. Nia crawled silently to the far corner of the cabin, pressing herself into the shadows. Caleb watched as the men spread out, 2 moving toward the front door, the 3rd circling toward the back. Amateurs. They were making noise, assuming the man inside was just a simple rancher. The heavy boot steps on his porch were the final warning. A rough voice called out, "Hey," in the cabin, "we know she's in there. Silas Kane wants his property back. Send her out and we'll leave you be." Caleb raised the Winchester to his shoulder, the wooden stock cool and solid against his cheek. He aimed not at the men, but at the lantern hanging from the porch eave. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar filled the cabin. Outside glass shattered, and the porch was plunged into darkness, followed by a string of curses. "She's not property," Caleb yelled back, his voice hard as iron. "And this is my land. You've got one chance to get off it." A shot answered him, the bullet thudding into the log wall beside the door. The fight was on. Caleb fired back, using the muzzle flash as his target. A man screamed in pain. The other man on the porch began firing wildly into the cabin, bullets splintering wood and ricocheting off the cast-iron stove. From her corner, Nia's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the chaos. The window. Caleb had forgotten the 3rd man. He spun around just as a figure appeared at the small rear window, the barrel of a pistol pushing through the broken pane. Before Caleb could bring his rifle to bear, Nia acted. With a strength born of desperation, she hurled the heavy iron skillet from the hearth. It flew across the room and struck the man square in the face with a sickening crunch. He staggered back with a cry, his pistol firing harmlessly into the ceiling before he disappeared from the window. The two men out front, hearing their companions cry and realizing their surprise attack had failed, made a decision. Caleb heard them dragging their wounded comrade back to their horses. A moment later, the sound of hoofbeats faded into the night. Silence descended thick and heavy. The cabin smelled of gunpowder and splintered pine. Caleb slowly lowered his rifle, his knuckles white. He turned to Naya. She was still in the corner, her chest rising and falling rapidly, the iron skillet on the floor beside her. Her eyes were bright with adrenaline, but not with fear. He walked over and offered her a hand. She took it, her grip surprisingly strong, and he pulled her to her feet. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, her gaze sweeping the damaged cabin. "They will be back." "I know," Caleb said. "And we'll be ready." In that moment, something shifted permanently between them. They were no longer a rescuer and a victim. They were partners forged in the crucible of a shared fight. The quiet understanding that had been growing between them had solidified into an unspoken alliance. They had faced Silas Kane's shadow together and had not broken. As they worked to barricade the door and shutter the windows for the night, they moved in a comfortable, synchronized rhythm, two solitary souls bound by a common enemy and the shared will to survive. Yerst. The failed attack on the ranch served as a catalyst. The quiet moments of recovery were replaced by a tense, focused energy. During the day, they worked to turn the isolated cabin into a fortress. They reinforced the doors, boarded up the smaller windows, and dug a shallow trench along the northern approach, giving Caleb a clear line of fire. Nia, despite the cumbersome splint on her leg, proved to be an invaluable partner. Her eyes were sharp, noticing details. He overlooked a loose board in the barn that could be used for cover, a rise in the land that offered a strategic vantage point. She worked without complaint, her silence no longer a sign of fear, but of profound concentration. Their bond deepened in the spaces between the work. They shared meals at the small table, the firelight casting flickering shadows on their faces. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Nia finally spoke of her past. "My people, they called me She Who Watches." She said, her voice low. "I was a storyteller. I watched the seasons change, the herds move. I remembered the old ways." She paused, her gaze distant. "Silas Kane. He does not care for stories. He only cares for the land beneath them. He burned our home, took what little we had. He said the earth was reclaiming an old debt." Caleb listened, the phrase echoing Kane's words in the bank. A debt of blood. The pieces were scattered, but he was beginning to see the edges of a dark pattern. This wasn't about simple greed. It was a crusade, and Kane saw himself as its righteous leader. Driven by a new urgency, Caleb knew he couldn't just wait for the next attack. He needed answers. He rode into redemption, leaving Nia at the ranch with a shotgun and a solemn promise to return by nightfall. The town was tense, armed men standing guard on street corners, their faces grim. He went straight to the office of Doc Miller, a man whose cynicism was matched only by his encyclopedic knowledge of the county's history. The doctor's office smelled of antiseptic and whiskey. Miller was a gaunt man with weary eyes, who had seen too much death to be surprised by anything. Caleb got straight to the point. "Silas Kane. You know the name. I need to know more." Doc Miller poured 2 glasses of whiskey, pushing one toward Caleb. "Kane's a ghost. A rumor with a gun. But the name, Kane, that name has roots in this soil." He took a long swallow. "Years ago, before the war, the land your ranch is on belonged to the Kane family. Ornery old patriarch, 2 sons. The eldest, Thomas, was a hothead. The younger one, Silas, was clever. Quiet, always watching." A cold dread began to seep into Caleb's bones. The recurring nightmare, the young man's face. What happened to them? The old man died, Thomas joined the army when the war broke out. Never came back. Died in some godforsaken field in Tennessee. After the war, with no heir to claim it, the government parceled out the land. You bought your section for pennies on the dollar, like a lot of veterans did. As for Silas, he disappeared, vanished, until 6 months ago when this campaign of terror started. Caleb's hand tightened around his glass. He pushed away the image of the pale face in his dream. It was a coincidence. It had to be. He returned to the ranch with a heavy heart, the doctor's words churning in his mind. He found Naya not in the cabin, but in the small, dusty crawl space beneath it, a lantern casting a halo of light around her. She had been searching for something, a place to store extra water. "Caleb," she said, her voice holding a strange intensity. She held up a small tin box rusted at the hinges. "I found this under a loose floorboard." Together, they pried it open. Inside, nestled amongst dried leaves, and what looked like a child's wooden toy soldier, was a folded piece of paper. It was an old land deed, the ink faded, but still legible. The property lines described were unmistakably those of his ranch. At the bottom, signed in a flourishing hand, was the name Jedediah Kane. Nia looked from the deed to Caleb's face. "Kane," she whispered. She pointed to a section of the document. It mentions 2 sons, Thomas and Silas, as his heirs. The coincidence had become a certainty. The blood drained from Caleb's face. He sank onto a nearby crate, the deed trembling in his hand. The fragmented nightmare that had haunted him for years suddenly snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. It wasn't a nameless field in Tennessee. It was a chaotic, nighttime skirmish rain lashing down visibility near zero. A figure had emerged from the mist, moving toward their position. Someone had yelled "Rebel Scout," and Caleb, acting on instinct, had fired. He remembered the flash of his rifle, the boy's look of utter shock as he crumpled to the ground. When they'd reached him, they saw the blue of his Union uniform under his rain slicker. A friendly fire casualty. A tragic mistake in the fog of war. He remembered his commanding officer hushing it up, burying the report to avoid a scandal. The boy's name had been Thomas. Thomas Kane. The ranch he lived on, the life he had built from the ashes of the war, was founded on the grave of Silas Kane's brother. A grave he had dug with his own hands. "Caleb, what is it?" Nia asked, her hand resting on his arm. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a decade of guilt. "This isn't about you, Nia," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It was never about you. Silas Kane came here for me." The realization was a crushing weight. He was not an innocent bystander caught in a web of violence. He was the spider at its center. Silas Kane's crusade was not random. It was a deeply personal, meticulously planned vendetta. And it was all aimed at one man, Caleb Marin, the man who had killed his brother and, in his eyes, stolen his birthright. The stolen locket was not just a trophy. It was a symbol, a piece of the life Caleb had built on the ruins of the Kane family. The revelation changed everything. The fight was no longer about defense. It was about atonement. But Silas Kane was not a man interested in apologies. He escalated his campaign, tightening the noose around Caleb. One morning, Caleb went to the well to find the water tainted, fouled with the carcass of a dead coyote. It was a cruel, calculated blow, forcing them to rely on the meager creek, miles away, a dangerous journey each day. The psychological war extended to redemption. Kane's men rode through the outskirts of town, not attacking but spreading whispers. They told stories of the rancher Caleb Marin, a man with a dark past, a man who had brought this curse upon them. Fear is a poison, and it spreads faster than truth. Old friends in town now looked at Caleb with suspicion. The young Deputy Finn, overwhelmed and desperate, urged Caleb to surrender himself for the good of the town. "He's just one man," Caleb Finn had pleaded during Caleb's last trip for supplies. "Give him what he wants." "What he wants is my life, Finn. And he wants to burn this town down around me to get it." Caleb had retorted, his patience worn thin. He was an island, isolated and surrounded. His only ally was Nia. She never wavered. Her own loss had given her a profound understanding of the nature of vengeance. "His grief has made him a monster," she told Caleb one evening as they sat by the fire rationing their clean water. "He believes he is justice. You must show him he is wrong." The final challenge came, as Caleb knew it would. Nailed to the door of Redemption's church was a piece of parchment, Silas Kane's elegant script, a stark contrast to the crude wood. "Caleb Marin, and the land cries out for its due. Your debt is long overdue. Meet me at the old mission at sundown 3 days from now. Come alone. If you do not, the redemption of this town will be paid in fire. S.K." There was no choice. It was a trap, but to refuse was to condemn the town. That night, Caleb cleaned his Winchester and his Colt, his movements precise and deliberate. Nia watched him, her expression unreadable. "You cannot go alone," she stated. It was not a question. "This is my fight, Nia. My past. Your past has become our present." She countered, her voice firm. "My family's land was on his path to you. My home was turned to ash because of his hatred for you. This fight is mine too." He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, the set of her jaw. She was no longer the broken woman he had found by the creek. She was a warrior, her spirit as unyielding as the mountains that surrounded them. He saw the truth in her words. Their fates were now intertwined. To deny her a part in this was to deny the bond they had forged. "All right," he said with a single slow nod. "We face him together." The day of the reckoning arrived under a bruised yellow sky. A hot wind blew from the south, carrying with it the grit of the desert. A sandstorm was coming. As they saddled the horses, Caleb paused. He went back into the cabin and returned with a small, leather-wrapped object. He pressed it into Nia's hand. It was a knife, its handle carved from bone, its blade sharp and clean. "My father gave it to me," he said. "It should have been Sarah's. Now it's yours." Nia closed her hand around it, her fingers wrapping tight. It was more than a weapon. It was a passing of trust, an acknowledgement of all that lay unspoken between them. They rode toward the ruined mission, the wind whipping at their clothes, the air growing thick with dust. The old Spanish mission stood like a skeleton on the horizon, its bell tower crumbling, its adobe walls eroded by a century of sun and wind. It was a place of forgotten prayers and broken faith, a fitting stage for their final confrontation. By the time they arrived, the storm was upon them. Sand swirled in blinding sheets, reducing visibility to a few feet. The sun was a pale, diffused wafer in the sky. The wind howled through the mission's empty archways, a mournful, unholy sound. They dismounted, moving into the relative shelter of the main chapel. The roof was gone open to the storm-choked sky, but the thick walls offered some respite from the wind. In the center of the chapel, Silas Kane waited. He was not alone. Nia was there, held fast by one of Kane's men, a knife to her throat. Caleb's heart froze. It was a foolish rookie mistake. He had let Nia ride with him, and in doing so had handed Kane his ultimate leverage. "Welcome, Caleb," Silas called out over the roar of the wind, his voice calm and mocking. "I'm so glad you could make it. And you brought a guest. How thoughtful." Caleb raised his hands slowly, his Winchester held loosely in one. "Let her go, Kane. This is between you and me." Silas laughed a sharp, humorless sound. Oh, it has always been between you and me. She is merely a prop, a demonstration of how everything you touch you ultimately destroy. He gestured for his man to release Naya, who stumbled forward but remained defiant, her eyes locked on Silas. The storm raged around them, dust and debris swirling in the cavernous space. This was it, the culmination of a decade of guilt and months of terror. You know why we're here, don't you? Caleb Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You remember my brother Thomas. You remember his face as you shot him down. A boy in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was the war, Caleb said, his voice tight. It was a mistake. A mistake, Silas's voice cracked with a sudden raw fury. You call the murder of my brother a mistake. You took his life, and then you took his land. You built your pathetic little life on the ashes of my family. You even carry a token of the happiness you stole. He reached into his vest and pulled out the silver locket. It swung from its chain, a tiny defiant gleam in the gloom. This should have belonged to my brother's wife, to my niece. A future you erased with one squeeze of a trigger. The weight of his sin pressed down on Caleb, heavy and suffocating. Silas was right. In his grief, he had taken the land without question, had never looked back, had never considered the ghosts he was displacing. You speak of stolen land. Silas Nia's voice cut through the tempest, sharp and clear as a bell. All eyes turned to her. She stood tall, the wind whipping her hair around her face, her gaze burning with a righteous fire of her own. The ranch you burned on your way here. The family you slaughtered to clear your path, that was my family. That was my home. You are not justice. You are just another thief wrapping your pain in a flag of vengeance. Her words struck Silas like a physical blow. For a moment, his perfect, righteous facade cracked. He stared at her, his composure faltering. Nia had changed the equation. This was no longer a simple story of a wronged man seeking his due. It was a mirror showing him the monster he had become. Seizing the moment of hesitation, Caleb made his choice. This could not end with more killing. That would only prove Silas right. It would only perpetuate the cycle of blood and vengeance that had consumed them all. He had to choose a different path. Redemption. It's over, Silas Caleb said, his voice filled with a weary finality. He let the Winchester slide from his grasp, clattering onto the stone floor. He stood empty-handed, vulnerable. You want payment for your brother's life? Then take mine. But let her go. Let the town live. End this. Silas stared at him, his face a mask of confusion and rage. This was not how his grand finale was supposed to play out. He had envisioned a shootout, a glorious bloody end. Caleb's surrender was a denial of the very narrative he had built his life around. With a roar of frustration, Silas lunged not at Caleb, but at Naya, grabbing her and pulling her toward the crumbling edge of the chapel wall. The storm howled, and for a heart-stopping moment, Caleb thought he would throw her into the abyss. But Caleb moved faster than he had in years, closing the distance. He didn't reach for a weapon. He tackled Silas, a raw, desperate move that sent them both crashing to the floor. They wrestled in the dust and grime. Two men locked in a struggle that was about more than life and death. It was a battle for their very souls. Silas was wiry and quick, but Caleb was stronger, his rage now tempered with a clear purpose. He pinned Silas to the ground, his forearm pressed against his throat. He could end it. Right here. One final act of violence to close the circle. He looked past Silas's contorted face to Nia, who was watching the bone-handled knife now in her hand. Her eyes were not urging him to kill. They were pleading with him to be the man she believed he was. With a shuddering breath, Caleb eased the pressure. He would not become the man Silas believed him to be. He would not answer death with death. He pulled back his fist, and instead of delivering a killing blow, he slammed it into the side of Silas's head. The outlaw went limp, unconscious. The wind began to die down as suddenly as it had risen. A strange ethereal light filtered through the dust-filled air. Caleb stood breathing heavily and looked at Nia. She walked to him and without a word helped him bind Silas's hands. The climax had not been a gunshot but a choice to live. As the last of the sandstorm settled, a fragile calm descended upon the ruined mission. The sky was washed clean, a pale, tender blue. Caleb, bruised and exhausted, hoisted the unconscious Silas Kane over his shoulder. The weight was immense, not just of the man's body, a physical burden of his past. Nia stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, a silent offering of support. The ride back to redemption was slow and somber. They led their horses the body of Cain's man, killed in the struggle, draped over his own saddle. They were not triumphant victors, but weary survivors of a war that had left scars on everyone involved. As they approached the town, people began to emerge from their homes and businesses, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. They saw Caleb gaunt and grim, leading a horse carrying a bound Silas Kane, and a hush fell over the main street. Deputy Finn came running from his office, his pistol drawn, his young face etched with disbelief. Caleb didn't just hand his prisoner over. He stopped in the center of the street, the entire town, his audience. He lowered Silas to the ground, where the outlaw began to stir his eyes, fluttering open to his new reality. "This man is Silas Kane," Caleb announced, his voice carrying in the stillness. It was not the voice of a hero, but of a penitent. "He came here because of a debt I owed him." He told them everything. He spoke of the war of the rain-soaked night and of the young soldier named Thomas Kane who had died by his hand. He told them how he had bought the Kane family's land, never knowing, or perhaps never wanting to know, the tragedy that clung to its soil. He laid his past bare for all to see, owning his part in the genesis of Silas Kane's rage. It was a public confession, a stripping away of the stoic armor he had worn for years. When he finished, the silence was profound. He expected judgment, condemnation. Instead, he saw understanding in the weary faces around him. These were people who knew loss, who carried their own ghosts. They did not see a monster. They saw a man reckoning with his past. Doc Miller stepped forward from the crowd, a look of grudging respect in his eyes. He checked on Silas, then nodded to Deputy Finn. "He's all yours, Deputy. See that he makes it to the federal marshal." As Finn and two other men hauled Silas to the town jail, Nia stepped to Caleb's side. She took his hand in hers, a simple public gesture that spoke volumes. It was a declaration. Her place was with him. The townsfolk saw it, and in their quiet nods and softened expressions, they offered their acceptance. The ordeal was over. The healing could begin. They're at Harborn. Months passed. The harsh winter gave way to a vibrant spring. The land, once a source of conflict and sorrow, was reborn. Green shoots of grass pushed through the hard-packed earth, and the cottonwood trees by the cabin sprouted new leaves. The legal paperwork from the territorial capital arrived, officially clearing Caleb's title to the ranch. A formal letter of apology was included, acknowledging the government's error in the post-war land grant and absolving him of any wrongdoing in its acquisition. Justice, it turned out, was not always found at the end of a gun, but sometimes in the quiet ink of a pen. Silas Kane was gone, sentenced by a federal judge to a lifetime of hard labor in a prison far to the east. His name became a cautionary tale, whispered by old-timers in the saloon, a story of how grief left to fester could poison a man's soul. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm, one of peace and quiet purpose. Caleb and Nia worked the land together, their movements a familiar, comfortable dance. They planted a small garden, repaired the well, and raised the foal that had been born in the heart of the winter storm. The cabin was no longer a refuge from the world, but a home filled with the scent of Nia's baking bread and the low murmur of their shared conversations. One clear afternoon, they walked to a small, quiet hill that overlooked the entire valley. In his confession, Caleb had learned from Doc Miller where Thomas Kane had been laid to rest, in a simple, unmarked grave. With reverence, Caleb had moved the remains to this peaceful spot on the land that should have been his. Now a simple field stone marked the place, with only the name Thomas Kane carved into it. Together, Caleb and Nia dug a small hole in the rich soil beside the marker. They gently placed a young sapling, a cottonwood, a tree of life and resilience, into the earth. As they filled the hole, their hands touching in the dirt, the act felt like a final prayer. It was a gesture of atonement, of forgiveness, of putting the ghosts to rest at last. It was a promise to the land itself that this would be a place of growth, not of sorrow. When they were finished, they stood for a long moment, looking out at their home. The sun was warm on their faces. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer held them captive. It was a part of their story, the foundation upon which they were building their future. Caleb turned to Nia, his heart full of a feeling he thought he had buried with Sarah. He reached out his calloused hand, coming to rest gently on her stomach. Nia smiled a soft, radiant expression and covered his hand with her own. A look of profound love and shared hope passed between them. A new life was beginning, a quiet miracle growing in the heart of the Wild West, a testament to the enduring power of redemption. The end.